Welcome to our discovery today on presidential roles in the domestic sphere. A newly elected president quickly discovers that the presidential office requires the performance of a variety of functions each day. Many of these roles involve leadership in domestic policy issues, whether it is Barack Obama's desire to overhaul healthcare, George W. Bush's priority of reforming schools, or all presidents' need to keep the economy sound and growing strongly. As leaders in the domestic sphere, presidents must interact with Congress, manage the economy, and serve as the leader of their party. Although the separation of powers precludes the president from actually creating laws, presidents nonetheless have significant legislative power. Presidents can influence Congress by lobbying its members to support or oppose pending legislation. Make sure you're writing these down, so I'll repeat that. Presidents can influence Congress by lobbying its members to support or oppose pending legislation, and by defining the congressional agenda in the annual presidential State of the Union message, a constitutionally required address to Congress, which you recently watched. Presidents also legislate when they submit the budget for the entire federal government to Congress annually, although Congress ultimately passes the spending plan. Did you get the 3 roles of the chief legislator? If not, please rewind. Today, one of the most important legislative tools at a president's disposal is the authority to either sign or legislate into law or to veto it. Although a veto allows the president to check the power of Congress, it also provides Congress with the opportunity to check presidential power by overriding the veto with a 2/3 majority vote. In giving the president the right to veto laws, the Constitution essentially integrates the executive into the legislative process. There are several variations of the veto, as we learned in our chapter on Congress. During a regular legislative session, if the president does not sign or veto a bill within 10 days after receiving it from Congress, the bill becomes law, even without the president's consent. But if the president receives a congressional bill for his signature, and Congress is scheduled to adjourn within 10 days, the president can exercise a pocket veto by taking no action at all. Further, during the presidency of Bill Clinton, Congress statutorily equipped the president with a new kind of veto power, the line item veto. Allowed the president to strike out specific line items on the appropriations bill, that means spending, while allowing the rest of the bill to become law. In 1997, however, the Supreme Court declared the line item veto was unconstitutional in Clinton versus the City of New York, asserting that it violated the separation of powers because the Constitution grants Congress the inherent power to tax and spend. If you look at this chart, it shows the use of the veto varies widely from president to president. Modern presidents are generally more likely to veto legislation than their predecessors were. A primary determinant of whether a president will regularly exercise veto power is whether the president's party has a majority in Congress. An exception to this trend was the presidency of FDR. As you can see in this chart, during Roosevelt's 12-year term in the White House, he issued 372 vetoes, or 12% of all presidential vetoes. Roosevelt chalked up this exceptional record despite having strong Democratic majorities in Congress throughout his tenure. But Roosevelt used the veto much differently than most presidents do. Because he was such a strong president, he exercises veto power to prevent the passage of even small pieces of legislation with which he disagreed. Most presidents save the veto for important legislative matters because they are unwilling to offend members of Congress over smaller laws that they do not favor. President George W. Bush vetoed relatively few, 15 pieces of legislation during his 2 terms of office. His first veto came in 2006 when a congressionally passed measure that would have eased restrictions on federal funding for stem cell research reached his desk. One explanation for Bush's scant use of vetoes is that while the Republicans controlled Congress, Bush did not need to veto legislation often because he effectively persuaded Congress to act on his legislative priorities. Indeed, 10 of President Bush's 11 successful vetoes occurred after the Democrats took control of Congress in 2006. But President Bush used a different tactic, the signing statement, to put his mark on the way policies would be administered during his tenure of office. A presidential signing statement is a written message that the president issues upon signing a bill into law. A presidential signing statement may, for example, direct executive departments in how they should implement a law, taking into account constitutional or political considerations. Controversy arose over the perception that the president used the tool of the signing statement to modify the intent of the laws. Critics, including the American Bar Association, complained that by using signing statements, President Bush was asserting unconstitutional legislative authority, and some critics compared the presidential directives to invoking the line item veto in some pieces of legislation. In all, President Bush issued more than 750 signing statements during his 2 terms in office. Although the Constitution makes no mention of presidential responsibilities with respect to the economy, submitting a budget to Congress reflects what has become another key presidential role. Let's write this down: the manager of the economy. Of course, the president does not exert a great deal of control over the enormous national economy, but presidents have numerous tools at their disposal that powerfully influence the country's economic performance. For example, in 2009, President Obama persuaded Congress to pass a $787 billion program intended to stimulate the U.S. economy. Obama's plan came on the heels of the Bush administration policies, which urged Congress in 2008 to allocate funds to bail out banking, mortgage, insurance, and financial service corporations that were at risk of failing. If you remember back then, the slogan was "too big to fail." By submitting a budget to Congress, presidents shape where federal tax dollars are spent and thereby set the economic priorities of the legislative agenda. Presidents also help to establish the regulatory and economic environment in which business must operate in the way that they can influence economic growth and employment levels. Central in President's oversight of economic performance is the appointment of the Federal Reserve Board chair and its chair, who play a crucial role in managing the economy. That's also referred to as the Fed. The position of Fed chair tends to be less partisan than many other appointments, and a given chair often serves under presidents of both political parties. In 2005, President Bush named Ben Bernanke as Fed chair, replacing Alan Greenspan, who had served for 18 years under both Democrats and Republicans. President Obama reappointed Bernanke to a second four-year term in 2009, despite criticism that Bernanke was slow to recognize the severity of the economic crisis. If you have been paying attention to the news lately, Janet Yellen was just confirmed as the new Fed chair, first woman Federal Reserve chair. But many lauded Obama's reappointment of Bernanke, arguing that appointing a new, inexperienced Fed chair would be destabilizing to already bruised markets. The appointment of a Fed chair has a lot to do with consumer confidence, as well as with support from the economically influential individuals on Wall Street, including investment bankers, stockbrokers, mortgage lenders. The fact that reaction to a Fed action, such as increasing the interest rate that banks charge on one another for loans, which affects other interest rates charged to private individuals and businesses, can send the stock market plummeting, sheds light on why presidential appointments to the Fed are watched so closely. Remember, the Fed is in charge of monetary policy. One of the most important domestic roles for the president is political, the function of party leader. As chief of one of the two main parties, the president is a symbolic leader for the party members and asserts influence in the party's operations by selecting the national party chair and serving as the party's premier fundraiser. The presidential function of party leader has become even more significant in recent White House administrations, with presidents working ever more aggressively to promote the reelection of candidates from their party by ensuring that enough money is available for their campaigns. The president also acts as party leader in the day-to-day operations of the executive branch, because many of the staff appointments to the White House office, cabinet, sub-cabinet, ambassadorships, and judiciary typically come from party ranks. Finally, at the end of a president's term, he likely campaigns on behalf of his party's presidential nominee.